All right. Welcome to the Lead Generation World Live podcast. Welcome all those that are joining us on LinkedIn and YouTube. Feel free as you pop in and you see us here live to say hello in the comments. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes. I got a couple guests today, and we're going to sort of dive into again, really the most important topic of the industry right now, which is the FCC's NPRM, which they call closing the lead generator loophole. And it's important. So we feel we want to bring on guests and talk about this from all different angles. And part of this industry, a big part of it is the Consumer Consent Council, formerly Leads Council, also known as PACE. They've got all these names, and we'll sort of dig into sort of what they're up to as well here in just a few seconds. But before I bring on both of our guests, I do want to encourage you guys to ask questions in the comments. Like I said, we'll see them if you're watching on YouTube or LinkedIn. Ask questions. I mean, you know me, I'm going to ask a lot of the dumb questions for you, hopefully. But I'm hoping that if there are some smart questions that you have, that you put them in the comments, and I'll make sure to read them off and give you credit for asking the smart ones. But do participate. Makes it fun. So welcome, Michael. Thanks for listening in. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to bring both of our guests, and we got Rob Seaver from Consumer Consent Council, and then we've also got Josh Stevens from McMurray and Schuster, a partner there that does a lot of work in this industry and is a big advocate for helping companies out. So as we are live, apologize for the dogs barking. We've got my UPS guy coming to the door now too. So anyway, Rob, welcome. Josh, welcome to the show. Rob, before we get going on this, can you just tell me what's up with Consumer Consent Council in a span of maybe just a couple minutes? Because I know.
It's funny, you put all the pressure on me because you said you were only going to ask dumb questions. I'm like, what if I can't answer one? What does that make me? Look, I'm Rob Seaver, Executive Director with PACE, and obviously a lot of the people may also remember me as Executive Director of Leads Council. As Mike formerly, said, we formerly were Leads Council. In late 21, we decided to rebrand more on just focusing on what were we trying to accomplish as an association, than just the name. And really, it all boiled down to consumer protection, consumer consent, and really trying to put the consumer forward focus. Around that same time, there was an opportunity for us to join forces with a nearly 4-decade-old organization, PACE, the Professional Associations for Customer Engagement. The goal here was so that we could cover the funnel from a customer journey from the top and lead acquisition and lead generation all the way down to that conversion and nurturing on the contact center side. So it was a no-brainer for us. There was a lot of Venn diagram overlap. And so today we are the Professional Associations for Customer Engagement, which also includes the Consumer Consent Council and many other brands underneath.
Awesome. And we should probably, is it fair to announce that there's a new president of the, or how's that work?
That's right. And he's probably there. He may have been the LinkedIn user that wrote nice. that is Gregory Gregg, who was our original OG chair of and president of Leads Council when we took over control over that from Access Intel and LeadsCon. We were born very close. Mike, you were actually one of the OGs that were running Leads Council and handed the torch to me when I joined. And so, look, there's a lot of activity going on. There are a lot of things that are dynamic. Obviously, we're going to talk about probably the most important one on this call. But it was time for us to look at the leadership in the organization and what we were trying to accomplish. And we just felt like there was no better opportunity than to go back into our OG and have Greg come back in. And just in a few short weeks, the amount of energy that we're seeing and the commitment from this all volunteer board has just been amazing. And so we're looking forward to seeing his leadership and how he's going to nurture these group of, like I said, all volunteers into a very well-oiled machine. So super exciting times for us. And and it couldn't come at a better time either, obviously, right?
Or much needed time. And I love that Greg is active in this, because he is a go getter and he'll get stuff done. And so I think it's great. So Josh, thanks for joining the call as well. As I mentioned, you're a partner at Murray Mack and Schuster. Did I say that correctly?
You got a little backwards. It's McMurray and Schuster.
Murray
but,
Schuster.
yeah.
Sorry to Murray, I think. But tell me your relationship with the Consumer Consent Council and what your firm sort of focuses on before we get going.
Yeah, sure. So we are a boutique consumer protection, compliance, and defense firm based in Columbus, Ohio. We focus primarily on marketing, advertising, and privacy and data security law. And our firm has served as general counsel to PACE for many years, well before I even joined the firm. And so in that role, we do your normal day-to-day general counsel stuff of reviewing contracts and whatnot, but we also are very actively involved with the Government Affairs Committee and in the advocacy work that PACE does on behalf of its member organizations. So that involves filing comments, which is something I'm sure we're going to talk about today, meeting with regulators, meeting with representatives, doing all the kinds of work that an organization like PACE, Consumer Consent Council, needs done to make sure its members' voices are heard.
Great. And we're going to touch on a little bit, because I do want to save probably about 5 minutes or so to talk about you guys have an event coming up, Rob, soon. And then also just the overall involvement of what you guys are doing on the Hill. Because unfortunately, if you're not a part of the group, sometimes you don't see it, right? But you guys are doing a ton of that stuff. And we'll talk about that. But let's dive right into the meat of this conversation and what the heck is going on here over the last couple months with the FCC, what their intentions are, what does this effect could be on the industry for those that either buy leads, generate leads, sell leads, whatever it may be. So the FCC has, actually, Josh, why don't you tell me what's going on with closing the lead generator loophole?
Yeah. And I do want to say I didn't come up with that term. That came from the FCC. So that is not the way we like to refer to it. But that's what they call it. So we'll use it.
Yeah. Well, just to tie back to and Greg and I, a funny story. I don't know how many years ago. Maybe Greg, if you're still listening, you can remember. We went to the FCC. I think it was the FCC or FTC, and they called it. It was follow the lead. I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's follow the lead. And again, at that point in the story, it was, okay, where is this going, right? They wanted to know, where is it going, started, where is it going? And now apparently they found some loopholes, I'm guessing.
Yeah. Well, what they think is a loophole. And so
yeah, of course.
Give a little bit of background. I think a little history lesson is helpful here. Yeah. Just so everybody remembers, in order to call using an automatic telephone dialing system or a pre-recorded message, if you're calling a cell phone for a marketing purpose, or one of the exemptions to having to do DNC scrubbing is what's called prior express written consent. And prior express written consent has a very specific definition that the FCC set out about what language needs to be in that consent disclosure, right? And how you can collect that consent. Well, a couple of years ago, in the Facebook v. Duguid decision, which probably everybody listening to this podcast remembers, but just to refresh everyone, that decision was by the U.S. Supreme Court narrowing the scope of what it meant to call using an automatic telephone dialing system. And actually, let me just real quick shout out to PACE there, because we wrote an amicus brief on behalf of PACE in that decision that was cited by the court as one of the as sort of backing for their decision. So that's the type of work PACE does, just as a highlight. But after that, what we saw is regulators getting concerned that this was going to open the floodgates to calls. And what the FCC is now concerned about is, well, if you get consent on a lead form that has 1,000 people listed behind some marketing partners list, consumers don't know what it is that they're consenting to and how many people may call them, how many calls they're going to end up getting. And that they view as a problem that they want to get rid of. And that's what they call the lead generator loophole. And so what they have proposed is a couple changes actually, to the definition of prior express written consent that would do two main things. One, it would require that all of those sellers be logically and topically related. It's not entirely clear to what, whether it's to each other, to the website, right? That's an area that's a little ambiguous, but that's the first piece. And then the second piece is it would actually require all those sellers to be listed on the page instead of behind a hyperlink. And obviously that's a huge deal for the industry. And I think that that's something even for consumers could be challenging.
Oh, you're muted there, Mike. $1 in the tip bucket.
So rookie. Such a rookie move. Great. So I appreciate that that history. So let's dive in. So that was proposed a couple months ago, correct?
Last month. It was at the March 16th meeting.
Last month. Mm-hmm. And now it's just a proposal. And now we're in a comment period, correct?
Correct.
Tell me a little bit about that. Tell me what Pace's opinion on this is, and what is being what is the comment that you guys are basically leaving?
Yes, Josh. Will you tell us what Pace's opinion is?
let's see how good my political speak is. No.
As you're telling that, Mike, I want to remind you. I mean, like when we're looking at this, we're an organization of hundreds and hundreds of members, right? And one of the things that I want to point out as Josh is explaining this, we're talking across the spectrum of companies that might have 5 compliance officers within their own organization and supply, the industry 30% of the volume, right? And then we're also talking about organizations out there that probably have no access to counsel. They're operating in somewhat of a vacuum, and this is as scary as it gets, right? And so, when you're looking at, and I think we'll get into this with Josh on the logical and topical, right? That's such a subjective term as it is clear and conspicuous. What happens is that what it means to one organization that might have all of the resource in the world to understand how they vetted out already what topical and logical means, versus an organization that may be hearing that term for the first time and trying to interpret it in a brain that's like, well, it's just whatever's logical and topical. That gets us to a point of what is Pace's position, because we're currently in that mode.
Okay, so before we dive into that, then let's just focus on that one aspect of it, the logical and topical. When I read it, my opinion was, if a consumer is going to a solar related website about putting solar panels on their home and fills out a form, that data needs to stay within the realm of the solar industry, meaning it needs to go to someone that could potentially service solar panels on a home, not to a Medicare offer, not to a mortgage offer, that sort of thing. That's how I interpreted it. But I know what you guys are thinking is, well, what's logical, right? That seems logical, but is that logical to everybody? Is that topical to everybody? Is something related to the home still logical and topical? Could it be gardening service? I don't know. Whatever it may be, that could be, well, topical of a home, or a roofing repair. Those things that are very similar. So I know the argument is okay, that's not very clear, but that was sort of my assumption on it, and I presume that's where the problem sort of lies, is these relatively vague sort of statements.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's sort of like the concept of clear and conspicuous, but the difference is with clear and conspicuous, we have 30, 40 years of case law and regulatory guidance to show us where some of those guardrails are that we have to try to stay between. When you're first introducing a concept like logically and topically, without those guardrails set, it leaves everyone to wonder. And in this industry, that's particularly dangerous. See, if it was something where a regulator, so I do a lot of privacy regulation, right? That's a huge part of my practice. And in the privacy world, there are all kinds of, well, reasonable this or reasonable that, right? And so when you implement strategies for compliance, you're always playing in the gray. Things aren't incredibly black and white. But for the most part, in those privacy laws, there's no private right of action. So if you get in trouble, a regulator comes and knocks on your door, you can explain to the regulator, this is why I thought this was the right way to do this. You're telling me I was wrong. Okay, I can fix that. Please don't fine me. Right?
Mhm.
I tried.
Yeah.
Right? But in this world where you have a private right of action, if you've got a bad consent and you do it and you place a call in a way that needed consent, then now you're in a world where you're opening yourself up to potential class actions if there's an ambiguity that you weren't able to solve. And so that's the worry with logically and topically, is it creates an environment for these fights. And some businesses may be comfortable taking those risks, businesses that are very well capitalized that can hire the fleets of lawyers to go in and have that fight with a plaintiff's attorney and before a court. But if, like to Rob's point about if you're a smaller business and you don't have those resources, that could be bankruptcy for you. And that's the fear with logically and topically.
Okay, so where does that stand now? I mean, is that still is that suspected to sort of go through? Where's that sort of in this development, this conversation? Is that something that they expect to, or you expect to go through? Just your personal opinion?
So we're at the very early stages right now. We're in the initial comment window, which closes May 8th. Then there's a reply comment window that closes July 6th. After those two comment windows, the FCC will probably start having meetings with commenters as they start working through the final version of the regulation. So I think there's a lot of potential for movement here. But what I will say is the FCC traditionally, before they announce a proposal, they've already given it quite a bit of thought. And so getting them to move off of something entirely is challenging. You might be able to get them to move here or there around the nuances, or maybe give you some guidance, give you those guardrails. Or if you can show how what they're proposing really would have a detrimental impact on the consumer, then they might move off of it. So that's where I think we are. I would not place
Yeah.
a bet on it coming out personally. But
You mean by coming out you mean being removed?
being removed
Yeah,
entirely.
yeah.
Yeah.
This really isn't new though, to be honest. I may please correct me if everything I'm wrong. Uh, because for years, lead generators were not what I thought by the CFP and the FCC, not able to sell data or a lead to or to a company that wasn't already a mortgage, or so let's go back to that solar lead gen form. Someone fills out expecting to get calls from solar, but they start getting calls from mortgages. I thought that was already a punishable, finable action doing that. Now I don't know if that's completely accurate or not, but I thought there were already situations where companies had been fined or investigated for doing those types of things and punished.
Well, maybe from an FTC UDAP type, unfair and deceptive, maybe.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
type of
Yeah, the
rule.
deceptive. Yep, I think that's sort of what it was. So, I mean, isn't that already sort of the same case? Like, I don't think, lead generators at this point in time or anybody were sort of able to cross sell in that manner, anyways.
So there's always been some risk to that, but I would not say that has been the highest risk item
Okay.
for the industry. And I think what's a little different. So when we're talking true deception,
Yeah.
right? So you've told a consumer solar companies are going to contact them, and then they're getting called by mortgage companies, that starts to cross into the world of pure deception, right? You've told the consumer X, and now Y is happening.
Yeah.
I think what's coming into risk with logically and topically are things where you told the consumer X and you're doing X-ish, right? So to use your solar example, what if that website talked about solar panels, and then you offer solar, you give the lead to someone who sells solar panel insurance. I don't know if that's even a thing, but
Mhm.
let's say hypothetically, right? So it's something that's adjacent
Yeah.
to what that website was about, right? It's X-ish. Is that okay under the logically and topically associated, or not, right? And that's the types of worries we start to have.
Okay.
Mike, one of the things that, and I've seen this just in my seat for years, there's a dilemma here because you have these organizations, and in some cases publicly traded, where you have a tremendous amount of pressure to gain revenue, margin, and in today's world, especially with a potential down economy, there's even more pressure to get more out of less, right? And so when you start seeing this, you see this dynamic between the sales and the revenue teams and the compliance teams, and you get this tremendous amount of pressure from the revenue teams that say, look, find a way. And it's a natural occurrence. It's not saying, hey, these organizations aren't saying, hey, look, find the most legal, slightly less legal way of doing it. That's not what that's going on. But there's a demand to operate in the most compliant way without crossing the line. And when you have that pressure, you start getting, and the law, as clear as it can be, is always subjective because it's always going to be judged by somebody. And that judgment may not be even what it was last time. And so there's this sort of guessing game slash, is that the interpretation of what we're seeing? And that really plays a role in all of this stuff, not just this FCC stuff. So one shop may feel from very solid legal advice, one shop may feel like that is a solid transition from solar panels to insuring what you just bought.
Yeah.
And then a regulator may not see the same way, right?
Yeah. Josh, do you think the regulators sort of intentionally do this, make it a little bit vague just for the fact that they don't fully understand the process as well? And it gives them a little bit of wiggle room?
The answer, Josh.
Or maybe
It's
Rob,
funny
you
'cause
want to answer this?
Rob and I were just talking about this the other day. Unfortunately, because the world is messy and commerce is messy, when you write laws, they're kind of rules that everyone has to play by, right? So
Mhm.
it's hard to write them with specificity when you're dealing with these complex, dynamic commercial environments. And that's why you see things like clear and conspicuous or the reasonable consumer, like whatever the heck that means, right? Or the least sophisticated consumer in the debt collection space, right? You see these phrases that are inherently very squishy and malleable because they probably need to change to fit different situations.
Mhm.
And that's where courts come in, right? And precedent. In the United States, in the US legal system, much like the English legal system, right, we rely on courts to tell us what the law means. But here, as I mentioned earlier, when you have the risk of a private class action, that's a scary proposition, especially if you think a California court's going to go one way and a Texas court might go a completely different way, and now you've got competing views, right?
Yeah.
Which happens all the time.
Yeah. Let's jump into the other most notable point about this NPRM or this loophole, closing the legionary loophole, which was the disclosure of
Mhm.
companies or partner companies. Basically, as far as I understand it, right now, currently, you're supposed to disclose who your partners are. And usually that's behind a hyperlink, usually, goes to another page and it lists all their disclosures, disclaimers, and all their partners. They're proposing that the people that are being matched with need to be on front and center on the page, correct? Prior to consent. Is that, do I understand that correctly?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. So that's a big difference because obviously, some, depending on rules, filters, location, all these sorts of things, a lead generator may not know until that consent is given based on how their program is built out, where the lead may exactly be going, based on availability. Is the company open at 5 p.m. to take that lead or that call? There's thousands of reasons why one company may get a lead versus another company that are going to service the same exact product or services. So that becomes difficult to have that up front on the homepage or the front page of that landing page. But tell me a little from your point of view what that is and where that sort of stands and how that could affect both lead generators and also the consumer, frankly. Maybe Rob,
I think that's the biggest thing there, Mike. Josh, I'd like you to give the legal reading on what's going on here. But at the end of the day, if you could frame it in the context also of the impact that, as Mike put, on the industry. But I think one of the things that we probably haven't focused in enough yet on this call, and probably do need to, is that this always has a one-to-one impact on the consumer. And at the end of the day, when we're talking about choice, which is really what it's going to boil down to, is what level of choice and how that choice will actually be presented and eventually consumed. I think that that's the world of the slippery slope of what do we mean? Would a Best Buy be able to advertise for Toshiba and LG TVs? Is that too many choices in the eyes of what we're looking at in the proposal, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, and again, personal opinion, all these opinions are my own. They're not the firm's or Pace's. Probably should have given that. And nothing I say is legal advice. I probably should have said all of that at the start of this conversation. But we'll get it in now. I think what the FCC's ultimate goal is to have consumers where they can pick and choose who they want to hear from. I think that's what the FCC wants. But if you're a consumer, and especially if you're comparison shopping, you're not going to know necessarily who you want to hear from. That's why you're going to the comparison shopping website, right? And saying, I need X product. Show me the people who can give it to me the best and cheapest, right? And so I think, what I'm hearing from the industry in terms of how to react to this disclose everyone on the page requirement is either we just can't do it. It's too many people to list. Well, if it stays in the rule, and you're going to have to deal with that, right? Or the development of a dynamic model so that you can put the matched people, or at least a smaller unit of matches, maybe 10 or 20 on the page, and confine your cell to that. Or I think the absolute, best case scenario is perhaps we can convince the FCC to still allow hyperlinks with certain conditions, like that the hyperlink can't just say marketing partners, it's got to describe the category of businesses that are behind that link, solar providers or something, right? Some sort of condition on the hyperlink, but maybe be able to still keep it.
And Mike, I'd also like to tag along on that it's not a one size fits all problem here, because what happens in some industries, a one-to-one match is easily attained. And it's something that you could just quickly go, well, here's the only provider for what you're asking for, right? But when you get into insurance and Medicare and these types of things that might not have an immediate response to the answer, right? Like, so you might need to collect more information. You might need to be further in that discovery period, that where consent is provided versus where it benefits the consumer might be different paths in that journey. And so I think that, and one of the things that I think we're missing here, and it's almost like you're hearing a painting picture of this big bad regulator who's out there to just, kill off business. That's not at all what we're seeing. What's happening is that a great deal of these regulators, the reason this comment period's in place to begin with is so that they can educate themselves before they render an opinion or a rule. And they're the first to tell you, they've been on our stages many times telling us that we want to hear from you. And in fact, that's what has happened. These regulators have reached out to us as a trade association and a leader in the space and said, look, we need to have more education as we go through this journey with you. So it's not as if they're just sitting on high with some level of ignorance and saying, this is just how it's going to be. We have a cooperation and collaboration going on where there is communication and dialogue. And so, I think that this is a combination of things that is going to be complex and not a one size fits all outcome. I mean, Josh, how do you feel about that?
No, I think that's true. And I think the FCC is going to hear from and take meetings with many different groups, right? They're going to hear from industry groups. They're going to hear from particular businesses, I'm sure, who are going to request meetings. They're going to hear from consumer groups who want them to take an even stricter position, or I think some of these consumer groups would just love an outright ban on anybody being able to call or text anybody at any time in any way. But, I don't see how that helps the consumer, but God bless them. And so they're going to hear from a diverse set of viewpoints, and then they're going to synthesize. And one of the things I do like about the FCC, to their credit, and I think the FTC does this pretty well too, is when they do issue that final rule, they will explain why they made the decisions that they made. And they will often, if you go down into the footnotes, will respond to individual positions brought up by individual commenters and explain why they did or did not agree with that position, which is really helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when going back to our earlier comments about how some of these things can be relatively vague, right? And so you can probably glean a little bit of insight into the thinking of it as well. So that is helpful.
I want to point out that there is an active biweekly call that we have right now open to members and non-members that is addressing, this response. And we're seeing a tremendous response to that call, and more joining every week. And it's been, for me, as bad as I believe that this, felt initially, I actually am enjoying what I'm watching and seeing as an industry getting together and having real, tangible, meaningful conversations about how business needs to be moving forward. I think this has been a long time coming to begin with, and sometimes you need that shock to the system in order for something like this, level of synergy that I'm seeing to happen. And so I'm not wishing this obviously on anyone, but what the point is that I'm really pleased with the industry response at this point. I'm incredibly impressed with how fast we've been able to get together this coalition, how quickly it's grown, and the quality of the content that's coming in every other week and throughout the periods, and how we're really seeing how this industry needs to be, shaped and molded for the years to come. And what's really nice is the common theme is consumer first. Like, how does this impact the consumer? And so I'm extremely excited and encouraged that, this isn't the end of lead gen as some may have professed. I think that this is actually a right sizing and an adjustment that was long coming. And I think we'll be a better industry and we'll provide better service to the consumers as a result.
And frankly, a lot of companies outside of some of the details are already doing this, right? They've been doing, in fact, most of them
Yeah.
are doing this. They're already thinking of the consumer. I mean, they've been doing this from day one, frankly. There's obviously there's companies that don't, and they need to, be addressed. But I think generally speaking, this industry does look for really two things. One is how can we service the consumer, but also how can we service our companies that are, leveraging us to scale. Because the lead gen process is actually very, very important. And I want to touch on this because going back to this disclosure on the homepage, if I'm articulating it correctly, putting it on the home or on the landing page, all the companies. I know there was a fear that they were requiring, maybe it was a separate comment or line item in the report, or the proposal, but it led people to go, well, lead generators will only be able to do branded advertising on behalf of that brand. Then was that separate? Was that a separate line item they were talking? Was that the same thing?
I think we're talking about the same
Yeah.
general area of the marketing partners list, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So there's a fee, there was, I know some, chatter was fear. It's like, okay, well, that means we have to become agency of records, for these brands, basically. And that would be detrimental not only to the consumer, but also going back to the second part, what I think lead generators, service is these brands. And the key part of a brand, and I was, worked for, I got into this industry as working for a mortgage company, and we could only do so much paid search advertising. We could only do so much brand advertising for our brand. We had a ceiling. But what we could do is we could leverage all these other brands, like the Lending Trees, like at the time Lower My Bills. These are all other brands that we could leverage to drive more consumers to us, so we could scale 100 times more because we can utilize other brands. And if that ability is no longer there, you're talking about major businesses that will no longer be able to speak to the amount of consumers that they could if they were leveraging other brands. And I'm talking I don't know these numbers, but let's just say, Travelers Insurance, right? Massive insurance brand. I'm pretty sure they buy leads. They come to the shows. All those consumers that come through them leveraging other brands will disappear. You can only advertise on search through your one brand so much. You can't have multiple things on there. You can only send so many emails. You can only do so much brand display so I mean, it would dramatically reduce their business and their revenue potentially. So it's crazy, that if someone isn't sort of looking at the big picture of what lead generators do for both consumers and the brands. But anyway, I apologize. I ranted there a little bit, but I wanted to sort of just address that a little bit with that, because I know there was chatter around, oh, well, if that goes away, then it'll just be, marketing agencies doing brand, stuff on behalf of the brand.
Well, and I think part of that fear came from the public knowledge proposal. So the public knowledge is a consumer advocacy group, right? And they proposed to the FTC or FCC rather a 1-to-1 model. So you could only get consent.
That's what it was. Yep.
Right. That is not what the FCC ultimately went with, but they did ask for comments on it. And I think that scared a lot of people into thinking that that's where the FCC was heading. I don't think that's where the FCC is heading. But they may be soliciting comments, to sort of Rob's point about education, to sort of educate themselves and understand why that's not where they want to head. Right.
I think it also ties back into the logically and topically conversation we had at the top of the hour, right? We just, if it makes sense, then it makes sense. But in those cases where it doesn't make sense and you're scratching a head, how did I end up getting a call from a veterinarian when I just signed up for a walk-in shower? I mean, look, you could say that maybe it's easier to wash your dog now, but I mean, at the end of the day, that's probably the only connection you can find.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what they're trying to really eliminate is
Which
that.
I think is good, which I think is great. I think is needed. I think, and I don't think any lead generation company would argue that necessarily. I think there are some that, should be put in place. But I want to take another step back just for a second because it's important that you mentioned a call that takes place regularly, and I want to make sure that people can participate on that. How would they go about finding that? Where do they go to get information on that?
Well, certainly anybody at any time can email me, Rob, at paceassociation.org. And man, that's super cool. I like this platform, Mike. I'm digging it more and more. But certainly email me, and we can get you connected with Isaac Schloss, who is over at dnc.com, who heads up our government affairs committee. He also is the chair of this coalition that we put together. And so getting you on that list and just showing up and, not being afraid to talk. That was the one nice thing I think about this call that I've seen over and it's getting even better. There are people who are willing to share their thoughts, ideas, and comments, and that's exactly what we need. And, ultimately, this is probably going to come down to where some companies see some sort of revenue hit. It's inevitable if you're not operating in a compliant way or as compliant as you should. There's going to be a right size, and you can tell when we get to those areas where there's a touch on a potential revenue area of the organization. But by and large, I've heard comments that are so reasonable that we could include even differing comments in some cases, and they both would be reasonable. And so that's the encouragement that I have. We also have, obviously, you set it up so that at the end of this, we could mention, the upcoming summit that we have in DC. I think that those are important events for those that are in this space. And so that is the 21st through the 23rd in Arlington, Virginia. And you can go to pacesummitdc.com and you can register there. And we're going to have the FCC, FTC, CFPB, the CTIA, and Josh, if you can think of any other acronyms that I haven't.
Don't we have the Ohio AG?
We absolutely now, and the Ohio AG is absolutely, I think, an important get here because he's also part of the robocall task force. And so, and what we're seeing, obviously, Mike, we're focused in on this call on the FCC, but that if you take that microscope off of just this NPRM, the activity is all over the place at this point, state and federal, right? So there's no shortage of us doing things behind the scene to help craft the standard and best practice for this industry moving forward, which is really the goal and mission of the association.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I appreciate you. So if you're interested in that, email Rob. And then if you're interested in that Pace Washington Summit, the website's up here as well. Let's go back. So thank you for touching on that. What other very important things what should we know about the NPRM, Josh, as well as what we just discussed? Is there anything else that we should all be aware of?
So I think those are kind of the key points. There were a few other pieces that got less attention because obviously this was the huge hit for the industry, or potential for a huge hit to the industry. But one of them is the actual finally formally saying that the DNC rules apply to text messages. Which is a position that the FCC and courts have had for many years, but then the FCC just realized, I don't know how it came up, but somehow they realized that they never actually formally put that into the rules. So they're working to codify that. That's not something that I think many people have objections to, because that's the way everyone's been operating for years anyway, because that's been the position.
Mike, I'd also like to add here that I think one of the most important things, and I learned this, I'm at a current event, Medicarians in Vegas right now, and one of the things that I heard, because CMS had just come through this earlier and this comment period, and one of the outcomes of this was that they noted the sheer volume of response in their response. So one of the things I want to make sure of before we get off here is, Josh, if you could help people understand the importance of, at a company level, as an association, we're gathering together the consensus of the industry, and we're going to submit that as an association. But much, much more important than that is the individual company response. And Josh, could you tap in on that for a second and explain how best a company could participate in that?
Yeah. So there are a couple ways that you can get involved. The first is obviously filing comments, and there are actually two ways to do that. There's the sort of standard long form process that we'll use. It's still an online filing, but it's, you got to write up a thing and then you got to upload it, and it's a whole thing. There's also what they call an express comment. So this is actually really good for individuals. So you can actually go into the FCC's comment system, and I'm sure, Rob, we can work together to put up some instructions for this at some point, and essentially just fill out a text box with your comment. And so that's a nice, easy way for an individual to make a comment. There you go. You're on it.
What a moderator.
I know.
Like,
we need this all the time, Rob.
I'm a master Googler, just saying.
If you're looking for a new job, man, I'm willing to hire you right on the spot for this, man.
But for the longer form comments, which are what businesses traditionally submit, those can come in the form of a letter, or you can do them in a more formal style like we will, like a legal proceeding. But it is important for individual businesses to file those. So like Rob mentioned, as an organization, we will try to present the consensus view. And that is still forming, right? This task force is still giving us insights and thoughts that we're trying to work through to figure out where's the common thread here that we're going to put forward. But that's one voice. There might be hundreds behind that one voice, but in the FCC's files, it's still one document. When you can get businesses to come in and give their own thoughts, you start to grow that volume. And I don't care what anybody says, volume matters in these types of efforts, right? Because I can guarantee you on the other side, with a group, like Public Knowledge that's going to, want a very tight view of consent, they have members, and they will go to those members and say, we need you to submit comments. And those members submit comments. Trust me, I've seen them, in the thousands. Mm-hmm. So we need to sort of give that volume to counter that. And the other thing I would say is, when you're thinking about comments, two things are really important. The first is the impact on the consumer and how you can back that up, right? So to the extent you can give specific examples of how what's being proposed would harm consumers, and how your alternative proposal, what you would like to see happen, would help consumers, that goes a long way. The second thing is, don't just give vague statements. Be concrete. This will have X impact. It will be Y number of jobs lost. And we think the language needs to say this.
Yes.
Don't just come in and just complain. You've got to give solutions along with the impact. Otherwise, it doesn't help.
And Mike, that's one of the initiatives that we have right now that's driving this, is the increase of empirical data. We're now soliciting that from the members of both the coalition and the association, so that we can include that in our response. We believe that metric alone is going to be super impactful to the overall decisions.
Yeah, no, I think so. Josh, you're recommending that companies, everyone, should submit a comment.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a guide or guideline or just rough bullet points that could be sent out to those that to sort of provide some guidance? Because I think my gut tells me is you wouldn't want to have a cookie cutter letter submission that's like duplicated 100 times,
Right.
you know, that's not going to work. But if you go, you know, you sort of just touched on two, but you know, if there's a guideline, okay, it'd be great if you can, in your own words, say how this affects you, how this affects the consumer, how this affects brands, and address these issues in your own words. That's sort of the guideline you can submit to through this FCC process. Is that something either that can be articulated right now, or something that could be potentially sent out? Because we don't have a lot of time. This is, I believe, the deadline is May 8th.
So it's May 8th for the initial comments,
Okay.
or June 6th rather for the reply comments. So that's one of the other things I'd like to clarify is you don't
Okay.
have to submit an initial comment to send a reply comment.
Okay.
So one of the things that we've been encouraging members to do is if they don't feel like they can get a comment together by May 8th, that's okay. Get it together for June 6th, and you can then also be informed by the comments that others have provided.
Okay.
Right? And so you can also refer to them, right? You can say, you know, we agree with this point in so-and-so's comment, and here's why. And sometimes that's a little easier to do when you're writing comments and you're not used to writing comments, is to go through what other people submit and essentially write a letter that says, we agree with this from this one and this from this one because of A, B, and C.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I don't know. I know it's just piling on work for you guys, but it would be super awesome to have like maybe a one pager with just, hey, that I could send out to people. Here's,
Yeah.
you know, how to, you know, here are the sort of main things that we would love to get you comment on and provide. And here's the link, like I just, you know, did to do that, at least for the express. This is the express response, or go through because like Rob said, there's people that have, you know, 5 compliance officers, and there's people that have 0. And those people that have 0 likely are the ones that are going to be most affected by change, because they also don't have the finances to easily quick technology to, you know, change along with this sort of thing. But they're probably the ones that are most passionate about, you know, this space, at least from a homegrown point of view. So yeah, if there's anything like that that can be sort of produced quickly and distributed, you know, I'd be happy to send that out and distribute that to all my network.
Mike,
and actually submit my own comment as well.
Mike, I want to point out though that although, and once again, the focus of this call is on the FCC NPRM, we're developing standards for the industry across the board, and we have them on the consumer consent website, consumerconsent.org. You can download the standards, and they by and large say follow the law, which has been in place forever. But we're also developing an SRO, which is a self-regulating organization where the standards and best practices are going to be elevated. And one of the things that I want to make sure of is that this isn't just a rally cry around, you know, FCC NPRM. If you take the microscope off, like I said earlier, then you're starting to see everything fluidly moving toward a common denominator here, right? And so I think that, you know, as much as I want them to get involved and engage with this particular initiative, I would much rather see them also get involved with the day-to-day things, because the fight.
Yeah, this isn't the only thing, right? This isn't to me this shiny object this month, but
that's right. That's right. So as we develop those best practices and standards, and they will have impact on your business, you need to have that voice. So you know, get involved and lend a hand in helping shape and curate the next, you know, lead gen 2.0 or whatever version it is coming up, you know.
Yeah, for sure.
We may have had 2.0 years ago. So
I think so. I think we're on maybe 4.2 or something. I don't know.
We were talking about faxes for lead gen in the OG days last night. So it was like this, the industry has certainly evolved, right?
Yeah, no doubt about it. And it evolves quickly. So tell me, you talked about the SRO. Where's that at? What state is that at? And what's the goal?
We've the 80% mark. Eric Josowich from All Web Leads, you know, he put it to me in a way that now makes sense. getting consensus for 80% is easy. Like, no heavy lifting, no real impact on revenue, and everybody can agree, right? The next 10% from 80 to 90, which is where we are almost complete right now, is a much heavier lift, because then you start looking at like, I don't think I'm going to agree to that, or, I don't think we're real friendly toward that. And so there's a give and take, and a bit of a, across the table conversation. And so we're almost out of that phase, which puts us in the final 10%. And that's where the rubber meets the road. Now, once again, we're talking about a standard that would be optional for members, that would agree to some sort of third-party monitoring to, we can self-attest all day long, but we also know that self-attest is just, like, hey, I'm not fat,
Right.
So, but at the end of the day, a third-party auditor would be, yeah, but your BMI says different. But the thing is that, for me, that's the next stage, especially for those lead generators that want to differentiate themselves from the others, right? I am taking the necessary steps, even at a cut or hit on revenue and profitability, to do the right thing to protect consumers and give them the right choice. And that's really where the future of this industry is headed. And and as difficult it is to get past that final 10%, you can write all the rules in the world. You can say, I have an SRO today, but if you can't get adoption, then your words are just that. And so we have to get a document in place that wasn't written by one individual, but a consensus of a group of people who are willing to adopt it. It's the only way that we can make this sustainable and doable.
Yeah. As like I said earlier, as once a lead buyer, I think my put my lead buyer hat on is I would want to be fully on board with this and support the heck out of it, because one, it helps reduce my own exposure to risk, and that's important, very important, especially from that point of view, again, where you don't always know what's happening on the other side of the fence. You may have active prospect, you may trusted forum, you may have Jornite, you may have these things, you may have Anora, yep, and yeah, you may have all these things in place to provide a lot more insight than you did yesterday. But it's still, having something that's tied to regulations and the effort, and regulators also sort of support, is something that I would be fully on board with. So my guess, I'm hoping buyers can be aware of this and support it and demand it, that their lead sellers or lead partners are also participating in this same thing.
It's a paradigm shift, Mike. The industry, I was on a call earlier today, maybe this call, they all run together, webinar. But the thing is that, early days LeadsCon, remember when we'd walk around in those shirts where I buy all the leads for any industry you have, right? Like quantity, right? This is no longer a quantity game. It has to be focused on quality. And with quality come cost, but the conversion should be higher as well, right? And 2%, 1.5% can't be the de facto standard any longer, right? We have to increase quality, and it costs that, but there should be a reciprocating offset to that additional cost. That's where the buyers and the brands really have to embrace that mindset, is that it's you're getting better and you're paying a little more, but you're getting a higher level of a conversion. And all of those platforms that you talked about, there's a cost associated with it to get it compliant. So it's a shift in mindset. It's a paradigm shift of how things have been focused so long on quantity, and whether or not we're pushed or pulled, it's coming.
Yeah. Is the point where it is today, which I know is not finalized, is there an audit process in the SRO?
Yeah. There has to be some level of verification that, like, what you attest to is true. And, we have an SRO at the PACE side. We've had one for years, and that audit is much more physical because of the complexities within the contact center that have to physically be audited. So there's a compliance team that comes in and literally watches the practice. And with the lead gen side, it's much more about, like, do you have this? Are you doing this? Have you checked this? Are you detecting fraud? These are things that I think along the way, the platforms are in place. We're consolidating the utilization of those platforms. We're looking at a lot of ways of verifying compliance at multiple levels. And I think that will be a great, kind of segue to the next version of what this industry is in store for.
Good stuff. Well, it is the top of the hour, and I don't want to hold you guys hostage any longer. So I will let you go. Rob, I appreciate you coming on and the work you guys are doing at Consumer Consent Council. Enjoy Medicarians. It's a great show put on by Jay Weintraub. And if you see him, tell him I said hello. Josh, I appreciate your expertise and participation with the Consumer Consent Council and this industry as far as privacy and the FCC. So thank you for your work as well, and coming on and being willing to sit here for an hour and explain what's going on to the idiot over here. And
Anytime.
so we'll have to do it.
Anytime.
We'll have to do it again. But we'll leave it at that. Again, I just want to put up before we go Rob's email, rob@paceassociation.org. I'm sure you can get to Josh through Rob as well if you wanted to do that. And then, of course, consumerconsentcouncil.org. And if you really want to participate, get to the PACE Summit in DC.com. So it's all there. I again thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.